Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Nadine Elzein about free will skepticism and the public health model response to crime.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Nadine Elzein, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick. Nadine has published articles on a variety of topics that regular listeners of this podcast will be familiar with, including the problem of luck for libertarianism, Frankfurt cases, and issues related to punishment. Today, we're going to talk about crime and the public health model for responding to criminal behavior. Welcome to the show, Nadine. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Hi, so thank you very much for having me on this podcast. I'm a fan of it. I've listened to some of the previous episodes and really enjoyed them. So as you say, I'm an associate professor at Warwick at the moment, and pretty much all of the papers I've written have in one way or other had something to do with free will, whether it's about the threat of determinism, the threat of indeterminism and luck, about Frankfurt cases and alternative possibilities, about the threats that come from neuroscience evidence and how that bears on legal responsibility. The one thing that tends to really link all of it up is an interest in free will and in questions about free will. So that is basically something that I've always been really drawn to. And I think there's several reasons why I've always been really drawn to the question of free will. So one thing is that it just links up a lot of different philosophical interests I have. I'm interested in jurisprudence, ethics, the philosophy of mind, and metaphysics, and free will is basically relevant to all of those. Also, one of the few philosophical problems I can remember thinking about even as a young child, before I knew what philosophy was or knew this was a problem that was debated. We have this really strong sense, this central feeling that we are free in some way. And we also know that our choices are explained by a bunch of factors that look like they're outside of our control. So I think any philosophical puzzle where reason just pushes you in different directions like that is interesting. But a lot of these puzzles don't actually have a huge amount of practical bearing. Doesn't matter how we resolve them. In contrast, because free will is really tied to moral responsibility, it's actually pretty crucial to lots of our practices and lots of stuff that's quite central to the way that we run society. So in that way, it's this abstract philosophical puzzle, which is really quite centrally important to us. And the way we resolve it really does have some practical implications. So I think there's just lots of ways in which that's always fascinated me.
That's cool.
Yeah, very cool. Today we're going to be talking about the public health model for responding to criminal behavior, which was a topic we briefly touched when we interviewed Greg Caruso back in season 2 of the podcast. For those who are new to the topic, would you say briefly what are some other models for responding to criminal behavior, and then say how the public health model differs?
Yes, thank you. So to my mind, the most obvious alternative is one that focuses on retribution, a model which is backwards looking and which basically deals with crime as a response to something someone's done and which we take them to be guilty for and to deserve punishment or suffering for. The idea is that when somebody freely and responsibly does something wrong, we basically regard their suffering as an intrinsic good and we deal with the crime in terms of retaliation for it. In contrast to that, I think there are lots of different ways of approaching crime in a forward-looking way, ways of thinking about how we deal with it, which focus on the kind of future which we want to shape. But not all of those are quite the same as the public health model. So one way we could deal with crime in an entirely forward-looking way would be to see our policies around crime as purely in terms of rewards and punishments aimed at encouraging or discouraging people by providing incentives and disincentives. Now, I'm not wholly opposed to the project of providing incentives and disincentives in this way, but that's a model which seems to me at best to be incomplete. So it's a model which really focuses on individuals and focuses on the choices that individuals make, but without thinking very deeply about why those individuals make those choices or about the factors which influence those choices. So there are a couple of things which make the public health model quite distinctive. One of those things is that it seeks to look at the societal factors which tend to cause people to be vulnerable to committing crimes. And it also acknowledges that those are the same factors which tend to heavily influence people's health and well-being as well. It gives us an integrated approach both to factors which make people vulnerable to crime and to factors which actually affect people's health and well-being more broadly. And it takes us away from the individual and allows us to look at the bigger picture. So if we don't look at those societal factors and we don't understand how many of them tend to disadvantage people on several fronts, what we end up doing is punishing the people who are already most disadvantaged. So I think what appeals to me about this model is that it gives us a kind of more effective and fairer way of dealing with the problems of crime, and one that has benefits beyond simply dealing with criminal wrongdoing.
Right. That's helpful. Thanks for laying that out. Greg Caruso and Dirk Pereboom have developed this quarantine model for responding to criminal behavior, at least partly because they're free will skeptics, and so they don't think that retribution is ever deserved. Could you say what you think free will skeptics are and what they aren't committed to?
Yes, thank you. So I think the free will skeptical position is often really quite misunderstood. So often when I talk to people about the problems of free will and about skepticism or doubt about free will, people tend to assume that if you're a skeptic, then you think that we can't make any choices at all, that we might have to just wait and see what happens. And often they think that we can't do any moral reasoning at all, that even the concepts of right and wrong are going to disappear if we don't have any kind of retributive blame. And I think that that is a mistake. I think this whole area gets confusing for people because there are lots of different things we often mean by terms like free or terms like responsible. And typically, free will skeptics are committed to skepticism about only one meaning of responsibility, which is something like basic retributive desert. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't really quite important differences between choices which are made voluntarily, or choices which are in line with an agent's values, and choices which are, for instance, accidental or coerced in some way. But the important claim is that even if we think that some choices are deliberate and that they span from agents' values, it's not all that obvious that this makes it okay to consider their suffering an intrinsic good when they do something wrong. And in fact, it's not all that obvious to me that we can justify thinking of the suffering of a wrongdoer as an intrinsic good, even potentially if we accept quite a robust notion of free will. So I think that how we get from conclusions about certain kinds of abilities or freedom people have to conclusions about retributive practices being justifiable is often not very clearly spelled out. So often it's also a big worry that retributive desert is thought to be tied to reactive attitudes. And we're skeptical about giving up reactive attitudes because we think that these are really key to what it means to treat someone like a person, and that it would be alienating to give these up. So I know this is something that's come up on previous episodes of the podcast,
Right.
but roughly we have reactive attitudes when we think that someone is an apt target for attitudes that are a response to the quality of their will, attitudes like resentment or gratitude for their behaviour. Now, I'm quite sympathetic to Pereboom's view that actually we can engage with people emotionally and in a way that isn't alienating without the full range of reactive attitudes. And in fact, I think that more of these reactive attitudes survive some degree of free will skepticism than other philosophers like Peerboom think. So, for instance, Peerboom concedes that feelings like resentment and remorse would be completely out of place if we scrap the idea of retributive desert. But this
Right.
seems at least less obvious to me in some of the situations where we care about these things, situations like personal relationships. And I think the link between these attitudes and retributivism is another thing that often isn't fully spelled out. So, for instance, if my husband makes a hurtful comment and I feel resentful, it's not at all obvious to me that what I think is that he deserves to suffer or that the suffering would be an intrinsic good. Now, I think it's both true, as Peerboom says, that we could interact with people even if we swapped attitudes like resentment or remorse for attitudes like moral shock and disappointment or
Mhm.
regret at being the agent of wrongdoing. But I also think that at least some of our terms like regret or resentment, don't obviously come with this strong commitment to retributivism. So I think that we could basically have quite an optimistic view of what free will skepticism might look like. And it seems to me that even if we're worried about the way that we interact with people and reactive attitudes, it's not clear that these all have to fall apart the second that we endorse some kind of free will skepticism. And we at least have questions to answer about how these attitudes are linked to things like retributive blame. Finally, I think I should say I'm not exactly a free will skeptic. I have some doubts
Mhm.
about free will. So I have so far defended the view that it is not possible to reconcile free will with determinism, but it might be possible to reconcile free will, even in the basic desert sense, with indeterminism. At the same time, I don't know whether determinism or indeterminism are true, and I don't think that that's a problem we can easily settle. And I
Mhm.
think that the view that I've defended doesn't obviously leave intact the full extent of attributions of blame which we tend to make in our standard practices. So, at least on my view, it might be that free will in a robust sense is less extensive and less certain than we ordinarily assume. And if that's the case, then I think we have quite good reasons to be cautious about any kind of retributivism. We
Mhm.
should be cautious because it might be that we're at least in a very poor epistemic position when it comes to attributing blame. And so we might think that retributive punishment is highly likely to introduce unfairness.
Mhm.
Yeah. Cool. Are are there other reasons to favor a public health model besides a worry about other extant models?
Yep. So I think that one major thing the public health model has going for it is that it's committed strategies that are evidence based and demonstrably do a more effective job at reducing crime and also at improving people's lives beyond crime reduction. So a strong emphasis on retributive responsibility tends to make us focus on individual and renders invisible various societal factors that can affect the way that people make decisions and that can influence the capacities and the characters that people develop, as well as the sorts of predicaments that people find themselves in. So it tends to presuppose that what we have is something like an even playing field when it comes to having the ability to make certain decisions or to avoid certain behaviors. But we might think that there are societal factors that at least leave people really radically unequally equipped in this regard. So, one way we might think of one thing that we might think of the public health model as trying to do is even up the playing field, ensuring that people are given the best hopes of developing their practical decision making abilities in a way that's going to enable everybody to effectively take responsibility and be less vulnerable to factors that tend to lead to crime. So, for instance, we know that people who suffer from poverty or suffer from adverse childhood experiences or exposure to certain toxins or who have poorer educational opportunities or who even suffer from poor nutrition and certainly people who suffer from poor access to mental health care, and various other different factors too, tend to be vulnerable to poor health and also tend to be more vulnerable to crime than a person who is not subject to any of those factors. So even if we think that there is potentially some leeway for freedom, what we don't find is an even playing field where everybody is perfectly equally well equipped to make the right choices. And we also know that basically lots of the factors that make people vulnerable to crime are factors that impact their decision-making abilities in all sorts of other ways. So these are also factors which tend to make people more prone to impulsivity, or factors which tend to make people more vulnerable to addiction, or more likely to have difficulty exercising strength of will, more likely to be poorly informed about the consequences of their behaviour, and more likely to have untreated mental health problems. And we also know that those are factors, but we also know that those are factors which are commonly thought to undermine free will by compatibilists and incompatibilists alike.
Mm-hmm.
So, risk of crime is really quite closely tied to factors that cause poor health more broadly and to factors that tend to basically hamper a person's ability to pursue their interests and hamper their capacities and damage their well-being. So if we think about crime basically solely for a framework that rests on judging the decisions made by individuals, those factors fall into the background and we fail to think about the kind of collective responsibility we have as a society for the kinds of conditions which people standardly grow up in. So I think on several different fronts, the public health model is basically giving us an effective way of dealing with a lot of these problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. So we're going to turn to some challenges or objections to the public health quarantine model now. And you've given a lot of thought to various objections to the model. And maybe we'll just start with, can you sketch for us what you take to be some of the biggest challenges for the public health model?
Yep, so whenever I talk about this kind of model, I'm always surprised at the level of pushback it gets, given that a lot of the policies, especially if we look at Caruso's policies, they seem really common sense. They seem broadly like things that I would expect most people to be on board with. And I think that there are at least a couple of things which tend to give rise to serious worries about the model. On the one hand, one thing you hear people worrying a lot about is the idea of medicalizing crime
Mm-hmm.
or medicalizing deviant behavior more generally. But I think that there are at least two things that we can mean by the term medicalizing. On the one hand, some people apply this term quite narrowly, just to policies that involve treating someone's behavior like it's an illness and seeking to alter it with treatment, ignoring any kind of broader societal factor. Now, that approach can often be problematic in various ways. But if that's what your understanding of medicalizing means, then it's not obvious that the public health model really is medicalizing crime because it's not focused on seeing individuals as ill and treating them as individuals with problem behavior.
Right.
So medicalizing on that understanding of the term is something that I don't think the public health model is guilty of. But there is another understanding of the term. Sometimes people talk about medicalizing and they mean it to include anything that sees something as broadly within the remit of public health policy. If that's what we mean when we talk about medicalizing criminal behavior, then it certainly is true that the public health model involves medicalizing to some degree, but it's far less obvious that we should see this as a problem. And I think that conflating the two things is often one reason why people perhaps feel worried about a public health model. So the worry which we find expressed quite often is that once we see behaviour, even in broadly medical terms, we're going to be committed to policies that seem dehumanising in some way, or policies which treat people in a way which is perhaps problematically impersonal. Now, at least part of the challenge is explaining what it means to treat something as a public health problem, and what it means to do that in a way that isn't impersonal or dehumanising. Now, in general, like I said, if we look at Caruso's policy suggestions, very few would regard those as dehumanizing in any way. So the worry is usually that there are inevitably going to be other policies which are entailed by the view or entailed by free will skepticism, even if free will skeptics aren't explicitly defending them. So I think part of the challenge is persuading those who are dubious about the position that there's some kind of principled way to endorse the policies which look positive and helpful and which most people could be on board with without having to endorse policies that look dehumanizing or problematic in some way.
Yeah.
Right.
You've also thought about responses to these challenges on behalf of the public health model. Could you sketch your response, including your focus on what you call taken responsibility?
Yeah, so I think that one of the problems is that we assume that if nobody is retributively responsible, then this is automatically going to entail that nobody could be able or could be expected to take responsibility for their own behaviour. But I think that taken responsibility is distinct from retributive responsibility. So taking responsibility is something we often do prospectively. It's something that we commit to doing in advance. And it involves committing to some kind of plan of action. If we want to separate out the kinds of medical policy that are dehumanizing from the kinds which don't look dehumanizing, one way I think we can do this is to think about the kinds of abilities which tend to underlie taking responsibility or taken responsibility, and to think about whether those policies involve strengthening or damaging those abilities. So, in order to take responsibility for something, I don't think we have to be retributively responsible. We often get children to take responsibility for things like looking after a pet, say, even if they wouldn't be blameworthy or deserve punishment if they fail to do it or they get it wrong. But there are various things which a person does need if they're going to effectively take responsibility. So we need to be able to effectively shape our future behaviour according to our intentions or our plans. And there are various other abilities that are needed if we're going to succeed in doing that. One thing is that we're going to have to be capable of exercising strength of will, avoiding acting on our immediate impulses, which might detract from our plan or detract from our commitments. We're going to need to be able to rationally weigh up our options. We're going to need to be able to effectively translate our decisions into action and to be able to be accurately informed about the likely consequences of our actions. And if we're going to take responsibility in a morally conscientious way, that also requires other skills, like the ability to empathize with other people and the ability to care about other people's interests and to be able to appreciate what their needs are. Now, when people think about approaching crime as a public health problem, often they envisage treatments that would undermine a person's ability to take responsibility for their own decisions and their own actions. So they might think about things like aversive conditioning with electric shocks or things like psychosurgery. We imagine that people are going to be essentially made safe by being treated in a way that involves undermining their abilities or hampers them in some way from being able to carry out their intentions. And actually, I think that the thing that distinguishes a kind of morally decent way of approaching crime, things like seeking to reduce poverty or seeking to improve access to mental health care, and things that look morally problematic, is that some of these policies involve strengthening and helping people develop the abilities which underlie a capacity for taking responsibility, and some policies would undermine that. So I don't think that policy has to be retributive in order to affirm agency of a certain kind and in order to encourage us to be capable of taking responsibility. And in fact, often the focus on individual choices and retribution is in many ways counterproductive for that. So many of the strategies used in the public health model aim at basically strengthening these abilities. All of these factors which tend to make people more vulnerable to crime are also factors which tend to make them less effective at making the kinds of decisions which they want to make. So one thing I think helps is if we think about other problems which have been previously dealt with on a retributive model or a blame model, which we've started to increasingly deal with a healthcare model. So think about something like addiction. There was a time when we thought that if you were an alcoholic, say, the right response was to blame you and to hold you retributively responsible for that. And that's rarely been effective in actually helping anyone. Now, there was also a reaction against that, and a time at which some of the things that have been tried are electrocuting alcoholics while they drink their favourite drinks in order to try to condition them into avoiding alcoholism. Now, that looks like it falls into the other trap. It looks like it's dehumanizing. It looks like it's bypassing their ability to control their own behaviour and inflicting a manipulative treatment. And I think one of the problems is that it's often been assumed that these would be the only two options we have. Either we treat people as retributively blameworthy, or we treat them as sick and then we can inflict treatments on them which are dehumanizing in some way. But actually, our approach to public health is much, much broader than this. So, other things that we've done include educating people better about the risks of alcohol addiction, limiting advertising and offers that encourage people to impulse buy alcohol, better labeling of alcohol products so people can tell how much alcohol they're drinking, publishing guidelines about how many units a week are safe. And options like this, it doesn't look like they are taking away people's choices. And neither are things like making more available talking therapies and, support groups and things like that. So it seems that once we see something as a healthcare problem and look at all of the different factors that make people more vulnerable to that problem, we can deal with it in ways that actually increase people's ability to take control of their own behavior instead of decreasing it.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So even if treating crime as a public health issue doesn't undermine taken responsibility, and even if it's not dehumanizing, I'm guessing some people might be suspicious of the approach due to the actual history of treating crime like a public health problem. Do you think that's a reasonable suspicion to have?
So, yes, I think a lot of the problem here is because if we look at the history of public health approaches to crime, or what people have called public health approaches to crime,
Right.
often we have found that they look pretty disturbing. So it has quite a dark history. In the past, people have been willing to treat criminality with frontal lobe lobotomies, forced sterilizations, all manner of programs of aversive conditioning, including things like inflicting electric shock treatments or paralyzing drugs. These programs have often been associated with eugenics and with lots of different strategies which have been dubious in many different ways, both morally and scientifically, and with practices that have often been really steeped in racism and classism as well. So, at least part of what I want to say is that there are good ways of distinguishing the broadly medical approach that seem moderately bad from the kind of medical approach that would be an improvement. And what that involves is that we have some way to move away from some of the strategies which were, for some reason or other, considered acceptable further back in our history. Now, another thing I think is important to remember is that while taking a medical approach to crime does have a dark history, taking a medical approach to medicine also has quite a dark history.
Yeah.
So, historically, if you look at the way we've treated mental health, it's been pretty bad. We've treated things like, depression or schizophrenia with frontal lobotomies, with forced electroconvulsive therapy. Even, not mental health problems. You used to be able to buy heroin cough mixture for children. So medicine itself has a pretty shady history. And pretty much every human institution, in fact, tends to have a pretty shady history. If you look at the history of marriages, educational establishments, religious institutions, workplaces, the military, you tend to find that basically throughout a lot of history, human beings have had pretty lax moral standards. And of course, retributive practices don't fare any better here. In fact, I'd say that the history of treating crime retributively is probably even worse. So I'd certainly rather go through electroconvulsive therapy or even a frontal lobotomy than being crucified or burned at the stake or publicly disemboweled. And these are the kinds of things which have been driven
Yeah.
by retribution in the past. So one thing I think we need to remember is that the only way any institution has ever improved is because it's been subjected to increased and better moral scrutiny, and because we've introduced various legal safeguards. So retribution and public health both kind of have to be subjected to moral scrutiny, and pretty much all human practices have to be subjected to some kind of moral scrutiny. And I think across the board there's an urgent need to distinguish morally bad practices from morally acceptable ones. So I find it interesting that the idea of taking a medical approach to deviant behavior often has this kind of terrible reputation. I mean, it's not that it's undeserved, but it's just not that it's that unique either.
Right.
Yeah. So you've kind of already started to answer this question, but is there a way for the proponent of the public health model to address the worry in a unique way?
Yeah, so I think the ability to basically prospectively take responsibility for our behaviour is one that's crucial for various health outcomes, but also for various behavioural outcomes and for our overall well-being. So strategies which serve to strengthen those capacities and help enable people to take responsibility are basically always going to be the morally better strategies. When it compares to strategies which involve undermining those capacities, or strategies that basically ignore the pretty vast inequalities that exist when it comes to the ability and the opportunity we have to develop those capacities. So I don't think this is just a problem for public health models of crime. It's a problem for all areas of life. And one approach to the dark history of medicine in relation to human behavior is to basically say, look, maybe it's too dangerous to put anything within the remit of medicine or health. So nothing should be included within the broad remit of public health policy. But a different approach is to just conclude that we need a better approach to public health policy, and to think that the problem is that historically the problem is to think that historically we've tended to have an unethical approach to public health policy across the board, and that's the thing which needs more attention. So one thing that influenced me in writing this was reading a paper by Herbert Morris written in the 60s, where he claims that we actually have a right to retributive punishment, and in some ways we're violating people's rights by not treating them retributively. And his argument is that if we don't treat them as retributively responsible, instead we're going to be forced to see their behaviour from a medical perspective. And he claims that once this happens, it's going to be acceptable to treat people like animals. It's going to be acceptable to manipulate them and inflict changes on them without their consent. There's no longer any need for legal safeguards. Any maltreatment they undergo can't be considered cruel. It could just be considered painful or not painful, but we wouldn't have any reason to ensure any kind of moral scrutiny. So once we treat someone as sick, we're able to manipulate them, treat them as animals, and treat them in all of these awful and painful ways. Now, my first thought on reading this was that I'm never going to go to that guy's doctor. That treated me like an animal and manipulated me and all of this. I would think that there would be a really serious problem there. But of course, it was written in a time when at least mental health policy largely was conducted like that. So I think what we should conclude is that mental health policy used to be conducted really, really badly, rather than that nothing should be included within the remit of medicine. So basically, we kind of have a choice. We can say, either we make public health policy across the board more ethical, or we can be dubious about anything being included within the remit of public health. But it seems to me, luckily, that public health has improved. We don't treat people with lobotomies and forced electric shock treatment anymore.
Yeah. I have a question about the extreme cases. So it seems like there are some cases of disease where we do override someone's freedom of choice. So do you think that there might be an analog for criminal behavior where it's so extreme that we have to take measures that might include taking away their freedom or manipulating them?
Yeah, so certainly if somebody is a danger to themselves and others, we do tend to think that it is permissible to lock them up. So one way we should think about this is on the model of quarantine or on the model of detaining someone under the Mental Health Act or something like that. So these are extreme cases, and I think we should certainly acknowledge that there are people who are a danger to others, and then we should think in terms of containing them for the sake of public safety. Now, containment certainly does involve limiting a person's ability to act on their choices because people typically don't want to be contained. No one wants to be in prison. But at the same time, I think that you can do more to make prisons less limiting in this regard. So at least we can, if you look at the model of Norwegian prisons, there are some people that might be there for life, but there's also a greater emphasis on enabling people to have educational opportunities, enabling people to personalize their spaces, to take up jobs that parallel what they would do in the outside world, and to try to develop the capacity to take responsibility. Maybe not everyone can do that, but at the very least, it seems to me that we can take a public health approach which doesn't automatically assume that bypassing people's agency is the only way of treating these things. And of course, you might think that if we reduce poverty, increased access to mental health support, decreased exposure to toxins and all of these things, fewer people would end up in that category in the first place. So at the very least, perhaps really having to restrict people's agency as a last resort. There might never be a world in which we don't need that last resort, but we might be able to reduce the number of people who need it.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Nadine. This has been excellent, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot from it. If listeners want to follow more of your work, where can they find you online?
Yep, so I'm not really logging into social media at all, but you can find my papers on Phil Papers or academia.edu.
Thanks so much. Yeah,
thank you very much.
In our next episode, our guest will be Robert Wallace, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo.